They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
The signal came through at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, which meant nothing because Tuesdays had stopped meaning anything around day 12. I was sitting in the communications room of the Astoria Column Visitor Center with my boots on the console and a cold can of creamed corn balanced on my knee when the static broke into syllables. Not words yet. Syllables. The kind of sound that makes you set down your food and lean forward because your brain has been so starved for human pattern that it will chase even the ghost of language across a dead frequency. Beside me, Nico was asleep in the office chair with his chin on his chest and a shotgun across his thighs. He'd taken second watch but drifted off around 2, which I hadn't corrected because Nico sleeping was Nico not talking, and Nico not talking was something I'd learned to value more than strict watch discipline. Across the room, pinned to a corkboard that once held tourist brochures, was our map. The Oregon coast from Seaside to Florence, annotated in 4 colors of marker. Red for confirmed hordes, blue for water access, green for cleared structures, black X's for the places where people we knew had stopped being people. There were a lot of black X's. The signal pulsed again. I adjusted the dial a quarter turn, the old maritime band receiver we'd pulled from a wrecked charter boat in Warrenton Harbor crackling under my fingers. And then it resolved. Repeated automated message. Naval support activity, Tongue Point Annex. Facility is sealed. Supply reserves intact. No personnel on station. Automated defense grid active on eastern perimeter. Entry protocol requires... It looped. I listened to it 4 times before waking Nico, not because I wanted to be sure of the content, but because I wanted 4 repetitions of a human voice, even a recorded one, even one that was probably months old, just filling the room while I sat there and let it wash over me like something warm. Nico? I threw the creamed corn spoon at his shoulder. Wake up and listen to this. He came awake the way everyone comes awake now. Total, immediate, hands on the weapon, eyes scanning the windows before they even focus. 45 days will do that. You stop having the luxury of groggy. What? Tongue Point. Navy Annex south of town. There's a broadcast. He listened. I watched his face move through the same sequence mine had. Confusion, recognition, hunger, suspicion. Nico Herrera was 26, a former sous chef from a restaurant in Cannon Beach that didn't exist anymore, and the only person left from our original group of 9. We'd lost the others in a series of events I will get to, but not yet. Because the order matters, and this is the part where things almost started going right. That's military, he said. Automated. Could have been running since before everything. Could have. Tongue Point is 4 miles from here. 3.8. Through what? That was the question. The column sat on a hill above Astoria, and we'd chosen it because elevation meant sightlines, and sightlines meant you didn't get surprised. The infected in this area weren't the fast kind. Oregon's coastal strain moved with a kind of stumbling deliberation, like people wading through waist-deep water, which we'd attributed to this cold and damp, though nobody actually understood the mechanism. What made them dangerous wasn't speed. It was saturation. They were everywhere the way rain is, everywhere on the coast. You couldn't walk 2 blocks downtown without finding 3 or 4 standing in the fog like they were waiting for a bus that would never come again. Between us and Tongue Point lay the old waterfront, Highway 30, the remains of a commercial strip, and a rail yard. I'd scouted the first mile of it 2 weeks ago and counted 40+ infected in a 4-block stretch. That was a Tuesday, too. Meaningless Tuesday. We can't stay here, I said, which was the argument I'd been making for a week, and he'd been resisting for a week. And the broadcast had just shifted the calculus. We have food for 11 days here. That message is talking about a sealed military facility with intact supplies. Nico looked at the map. I could see him counting the red marks between our position and the coast road south. Who else heard that signal, Marin? My name in his mouth always carried a slight accusation. I'd done something he hadn't identified yet. anyone with a maritime receiver. So, potentially everyone. We left the column at dawn because Nico insisted on daylight, and I'd conceded the point. Not because I agreed the visibility was purely an advantage, since the infected responded to movement and daylight meant they tracked you further, but because the alternative was arguing with Nico for another 6 hours, and I had learned exactly which disagreements were worth that cost. This one wasn't. The route I'd planned avoided downtown entirely. We'd drop south off Coxcomb Hill through the residential streets, cut east along the tree line paralleling Highway 30, then follow the rail corridor to the Tongue Point Peninsula. On paper, it was clean. On paper, everything is clean. Paper doesn't include the family of 4 standing motionless in a driveway on Franklin Avenue. 2 adults and 2 small figures, all facing the same direction, like they'd been mid-conversation when it took them, and had simply never turned it away from each other. I saw them first. I put my hand on Nico's chest, and we stopped. 30 yards, left side. He looked. I watched the muscles in his jaw do the thing they did now, which was clench and release in a rhythm that had nothing to do with chewing. 45 days, and we still hadn't gotten used to the small ones. You would think repetition would dull it. You would be wrong about that. We crossed to the right side of the street and moved in a low crouch behind a row of parked cars whose tires had gone soft. The infected family didn't turn. They rarely did unless you broke their threshold. Approximately 15 feet, we'd estimated through terrible experiential learning. Inside 15 feet, their heads would snap towards you with a wet, mechanical precision, and then you had about 3 seconds before the sound they made brought others. That sound. I won't describe it yet. I'm not ready to describe it yet. We cleared Franklin and cut through a backyard where someone had been building a chicken coop. The tools were still laid out. A level, a box of screws, a pencil behind the ear of a severed head sitting on the workbench, which I did not look at twice. Nico crossed himself, a habit he developed around day 20 despite having told me in our first conversation that he was a committed atheist. I hadn't pointed out the contradiction. Contradictions were all we had left. By 7:30, we'd reached the tree line along Highway 30. The fog was burning off in patches, revealing the road in cross-sections. A jackknifed logging truck here, an overturned sedan there. The usual vocabulary of collapse. Nothing moved on the asphalt. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Marin, hold up. Nico was crouched at the tree line, pointing east. I followed his finger and saw what he saw. A column of smoke rising from the direction of Tongue Point, thin, controlled. The kind of smoke that comes from a managed fire, not a structure burn. Someone's already there, he said. Or someone's near there. Smoke doesn't mean they've gotten inside. It means we're not the only ones who heard the broadcast. I told you that last night. You told me potentially. I'm upgrading your assessment. This was the dynamic between us. I planned. He refined. And somewhere in the friction, we arrived at decisions that were better than either of us would have made alone. It was not friendship. Friendship implies choice. And Nico and I had not chosen each other. We'd been assigned each other by the simple arithmetic of survival. Everyone else in our group was dead. And solitude in this new world was a death sentence with a variable delay. We paralleled the highway for another mile before the rail corridor appeared below us. A double set of tracks cutting east through scrub brush and blackberry thickets. The tracks were clear. Infected didn't gather on railroad lines for reasons we didn't understand. Something about the gravel ballast, maybe. Or the openness of the sight lines. Whatever the cause, rail corridors had become our highways. And this one ran almost directly to the Tongue Point Peninsula. We dropped down to the tracks and started walking. The morning was cold. February on the Oregon coast is a specific kind of misery. Not the dramatic cold of mountain snow, but a penetrating damp that finds every seam in your clothing and settles into your joints like it owns them. I've been wearing the same 3 layers for 2 weeks. Nico had a rain jacket he'd taken from a dead man in Seaside, which he never talked about and I never asked about. A mile down the tracks, we found the first sign that the smoke people had come from the east. Boot prints in the mud beside the rails. Multiple sets, different sizes. At least 5 individuals, possibly more, moving in the same direction we were. Recent, Nico said, crouching. Last 12 hours. They're ahead of us. We looked at each other across the tracks, and in that look was the entire negotiation. Do we go faster and risk catching up to a group of unknown people? Or do we hang back and risk them getting into the facility first and sealing it behind them? Nico's eyes said careful. My legs said move. I stood up and started walking faster. After a moment, I heard his boots on the gravel behind me. He didn't agree. He just followed. That was how most of our decisions got made. The Tongue Point Peninsula is a finger of land jutting north into the Columbia River, about 3 miles east of Astoria proper. Before the outbreak, I'd driven past the turnoff 100 times without ever going down there. It was one of those places that existed on maps, but not in anyone's daily life. A decommissioned naval station turned Job Corps campus turned federal surplus property, the kind of place that accumulates institutional identities like sediment layers. The broadcast had called it Naval Support Activity, Tongue Point Annex, which suggested the military had reactivated at least part of it before everything fell apart. We reached the Peninsula Access Road by mid-morning. The road dropped from the rail corridor through a stand of Sitka spruce and opened onto a narrow causeway with water on both sides. The river to the north, a tidal slough to the south. The causeway was the only land approach, and it was blocked. Someone had parked 2 flatbed trucks nose to nose across the road, creating a gate of sorts. And behind the trucks, I could see the shapes of people moving. Living people, vertical and purposeful, and wearing clothes that fit, which was more than I could say for some of the survivors we'd encountered. Well, Nico said, they beat us. The facility's beyond them. This is just the road. The road is the only way in, unless you want to swim the Columbia in February. He had a point. The water on either side of the causeway was black and moving with their kind of current that doesn't negotiate. Swimming was theoretical at best. So we stood at the tree line and watched the truck barricade and the people behind it and weighed our options, which were approach covertly or turn around. I was calculating the covert route along the slough bank, through the mud, around the south side of the peninsula, when one of the figures behind the trucks raised a hand and waved. Not a warning wave, a greeting wave, the kind of wave a person gives when they've been expecting you. They see us, Nico said unnecessarily. I have eyes. What do? We walk down there like people, weapon visible but not raised. Hands where they can see them. We descended the slope to the causeway. As we got closer, the figures resolved into specifics. 3 people behind the trucks, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a hunting rifle slung over one shoulder, standing on the bed of the left flatbed. A younger man, early 20s, heavy build, buzz cut, standing at ground level with what looked like a fire axe, and a third person sitting on the hood of the right truck, legs dangling, holding a pair of binoculars. The gray-haired woman spoke first. You hear the broadcast? Yes. How far'd you come? Astoria, the column. She nodded like she knew exactly where I meant. I'm Dana Marsh. This is Tomas. She indicated the buzz cut. And that's Priya. The one with the binoculars raised a hand but didn't speak. Marin, I said. This is Nico. You carrying anything besides the shotgun and whatever's in that pack? A 9mm, some canned food, a radio. Dana Marsh's posture shifted. What kind? Maritime band receiver. That's how we heard the broadcast. We heard it on a car stereo, Tomas said, which was the first indication that the signal was being pushed across multiple frequencies. Not a narrow broadcast, but a wide one. Designed to reach as many receivers as possible, military thinking. Cast the net wide. Dana climbed down from the truck bed with the ease of someone who'd been climbing things her whole life. She was weathered the way coastal people get weathered, tanned and lined from wind, not sun. A fisherwoman, I'd guess later. And I'd be right. "Here's the situation," she said, and the directness in her voice was so disorienting that I almost laughed, because it had been weeks since anyone had opened a conversation with the assumption that organized information exchange was possible. "The facility is a quarter-mile down this road. The gate's sealed. Electronic lock, heavy gauge. The broadcast mentions an entry protocol, but it cuts off before giving the code. We've been here since last night trying everything. 6-digit combinations. Nothing. How many of you total? We're it? 3. No one else has come? You're the first," she paused, "that we've let through." The implication hung. I looked at Thomas with his fire axe and Priya on the truck hood with her binoculars and understood that others had come and been turned away, or had seen the barricade and chosen not to approach, or some third possibility I didn't want to think about yet. "We're not trying to take anything from you," I said, "but we need in there as much as you do." Dana Marsh studied me for a long 5 seconds. "Can you work a radio?" "I've been working one for 3 weeks. Then maybe you can pull the rest of that broadcast. The part with the entry protocol. Because if nobody opens that gate in the next 24 hours, the people who show up after you won't be as polite as you are. And there won't be 3 of them." Nico and I set up in the cab of the right-hand flatbed while Dana briefed us on the peninsula's geography. She'd been here before the outbreak. Her brother had worked at the Job Corps campus years ago, and she'd visited him twice. The Naval Annex was separate from the campus, situated at the tip of the peninsula behind a concrete perimeter wall with a single vehicle gate and no pedestrian entrances. The wall was 12 feet high and topped with razor wire that looked new, installed during the reactivation, she assumed. Beyond it, she could see the roof lines of several buildings, a large warehouse or hangar, 2 smaller structures, and something with an antenna array on top that was probably the source of the broadcast. "My brother told me they used to store mothballed ships here," she said. "Navy vessels, decommissioned destroyers, that kind of thing. The docks are on the north side." "Ships," Nico said the word like he was tasting it. "Ships with fuel? Ships from the 1960s. I wouldn't count on them running." I set up the maritime receiver on the dashboard and started scanning. The broadcast was there. Same loop, same content. I listened to it 8 more times, trying to catch anything in the static at the edges. On the 9th pass, I heard it. A faint sub-signal buried under the primary broadcast, same frequency but lower amplitude, like someone whispering beneath a conversation. "Nico, do we still have the signal booster from the charter boat? In the bottom of the pack. Get it." He dug through our supplies while I held the frequency. The booster was a crude inline amplifier we'd rigged from marine electronics. Not elegant, but it added about 12 decibels of gain to anything the receiver pulled in. I wired it in, adjusted the squelch, and the sub-signal surfaced. It was a different voice, not recorded, or, if recorded, recorded separately in different conditions. A man's voice, younger, speaking quickly. "Override code for vehicular gate is 772419. Repeat, 772419. Be advised, the eastern grid is lethal to human contact. Approach from the west, causeway only. Interior buildings are unlocked. Power is generator-fed. Diesel reserves in Building C. If you are receiving this, the primary garrison has been evacuated to Carrier Group 7. No extraction is coming. This facility is yours if you can reach it. God help us all. Override code 772. I wrote the numbers on my palm. Then I wrote them on Nico's palm. Then I said them out loud twice. Dana was standing outside the cab. I opened the door and said, 772419. Her face did something complicated. You found it. It was hidden under the main broadcast, lower power. You'd need an amplifier to hear it. Or a maritime receiver with gain. She looked at me with a reassessment that I felt physically, like being reweighed. Let's go. The 4 of us. Priya had climbed down from her perch and was walking with us now, still silent. moved down the access road. The asphalt was cracked and weedy, but passable. Sitka spruce lined both sides, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel that blocked the sky and muffled our footsteps. I could smell the river, brackish and cold. The gate appeared around a bend. It was exactly as Dana had described. Heavy steel set into a concrete wall, with an electronic keypad on a stainless steel post. The wall extended in both directions, vanishing into the trees. Above it, the razor wire caught the midday light in small, vicious points. I punched in the code. For 3 seconds, nothing happened, and I felt something drop in my chest. Then a mechanical clunk, deep inside the wall, and the gate began to slide sideways on a track, motor whining with the effort of months of disuse. Behind the gate, a paved courtyard, 3 buildings arranged in a U-shape around it. The antenna building at the far end, a diesel generator humming, actually humming, vibrating the air with the steady pulse of machinery that was running, that had been running, that someone had set up to keep running without human hands. And no infected. Not one. The courtyard was clean, swept by automated something or by wind, and empty in a way that felt intentional rather than abandoned. Priya spoke for the first time. Her voice was low, accented. South Asian, maybe British educated. "It's warm," she said, and she was right. The air inside the wall was perceptibly warmer, not heated but sheltered from the coastal wind in a way that felt almost domestic. We stood in the courtyard and looked at each other. 5 people who had been strangers 12 hours ago, and nobody moved toward the buildings, because we'd all learned the same lesson by now. The thing that looks like safety is the thing you have to be most afraid of. Dana broke it. "Marin, Nico, take the left building. Tomas, Priya, take the right. I'll check the antenna building. We clear everything before we claim anything. 10 minutes. Meet back here." Nobody argued. I was starting to understand why she was in charge. The left building was a supply depot, and the broadcast had not lied. Nico and I moved through it, room by room, clearing corners with weapons raised, and found nothing alive, nothing dead, nothing infected. What we found instead was inventory, shelved, labeled, organized military inventory in quantities that made me stop walking and just stand in the middle of an aisle and breathe. MRES, cases upon cases, stacked on pallets, dated for consumption through 2028. Water purification tablets by the thousands, medical supplies in sealed containers, antibiotics, sutures, surgical tools, IV equipment, blankets, sleeping bags rated to -40, clothing in multiple sizes, all military surplus but clean and folded. Batteries, flashlights, 2-way radios, 12 of them, still in packaging. A rack of M4 carbines behind a locked cage, the cage key hanging on a hook beside it. Whoever left had wanted their next person to be armed quickly. "Marin," Nico's voice came from 2 aisles over, and it sounded strange. Thin. I found him standing in front of a shelf of canned food. Not MREs, but actual canned goods, commercial brands, the kind of things that used to line supermarket shelves. Green beans, corn, tomato sauce, peaches and syrup. He was holding a can of peaches and his hands were shaking. "Hey," I put my hand on his arm. "We're okay. This is enough for 50 people for a year." "I know. Why did they leave this?" That was the question I'd been turning over since the gate opened. The sub-signal had said the garrison evacuated to a carrier group. They'd left by sea. They'd left in a hurry. And they'd left behind enough supplies to sustain a small community indefinitely, which meant either they couldn't carry it, or they didn't expect to need it, because they thought the carrier group would provide, or the possibility I didn't say aloud. They left because something about this place was worse than what was outside it, and the supplies didn't matter because no one was supposed to stay. I kept that thought to myself. Nico was holding canned peaches and shaking. And there are moments when strategic thinking is cruelty. We finished clearing the building and returned to the courtyard. Dana was already there, standing in front of the antenna building with an expression I hadn't seen on a human face in weeks. Cautious satisfaction, not joy, satisfaction. The expression of someone who has solved the problem in front of them and is already calculating the next one. Generators diesel, she said. Building C, like the broadcast said. Tanks 3/4 full. At current draw, it'll run for about 6 months. The antenna's automated. The broadcast is on a loop triggered by the generator power. When the generator runs, the broadcast runs. So it's been broadcasting since the garrison left, I said. Since the garrison left. Which means everyone within receiver range has had 45 days to hear it. The weight of that settled on all of us. 45 days of broadcast. Anyone with a radio, a car stereo, a functioning receiver of any kind within. What? 50 miles? 100? Could have picked it up. The fact that only 5 of us were here either meant the signal range was shorter than I thought. Or most people with radios were already dead. Or others were coming and simply hadn't arrived yet. Tomas and Priya emerged from the right building. Barracks, Tomas reported. 12 rooms, 2 bunks each. Clean, running water. Running water? Nico's voice cracked on the second word. There's a well system, electric pump tied to the generator. Running water. I hadn't processed what that meant until Nico's voice cracked. We'd been drinking from streams and collected rainwater for 6 weeks. The idea of a faucet, of turning a handle and having clean water arrive without effort, was so foreign that it felt like a memory of a different species civilization. The right building also has a kitchen, Priya added. Industrial. Walk-in cooler not running, but the gas stove is operational. How do you know? I turned it on. She said this flatly, as if testing whether a stove worked was the most natural thing in the world. And I realized that Priya's silence wasn't shyness or trauma. It was efficiency. She didn't speak because she was busy doing things. Dana assembled us in the courtyard center. Here's what we have: shelter, food, water, power, weapons, medical supplies, and a walled perimeter. Here's what we don't have: certainty about who else is coming, knowledge of why the military actually left, or any information about what's happening beyond our radio range. I propose we stay, secure the position, and figure out the rest as it comes. Anyone disagree? Nobody disagreed. I noticed she hadn't asked for a vote. She'd proposed and checked for dissent, which is a different thing entirely. It assumes the action unless someone actively stops it. Effective. Then let's get those trucks off the causeway and onto this courtyard. I want the road approach looking untouched by tonight. If anyone comes, I want to know about it before they know about us. By nightfall, we had the gate resealed, the trucks moved, and the courtyard organized into functional zones. Dana assigned rooms in the barracks without asking for preferences. Nico and me in adjacent rooms, Tomas across the hall, Priya and Dana at the far end. The logic was unstated but clear. The 2 pairs who already knew each other were separated by the person who knew neither, creating a buffer against faction. I took a shower. I'm going to say that again because you need to understand what it meant. I took a shower. Hot water from a gas-heated tank flowing over skin that hadn't been properly clean in over a month. I stood under it for 20 minutes and watched 45 days of grime and fear run off my body in gray rivulets. And I cried, not from sadness, but from the sheer physiological relief of warmth and cleanliness. My body responding to normalcy the way a drought-cracked field responds to rain. Not gradually, but in a sudden, overwhelming absorption. Afterward, in clean military-issue clothing that was 2 sizes too large, I found Nico in the kitchen. He'd cooked. Actual cooking. Rice from the supply depot, canned chicken, rehydrated vegetables, and a sauce made from things I didn't ask about because the smell alone was enough to make my knees weak. The sous chef had resurfaced. He'd set 5 places at a metal prep table and was plating with the unconscious precision of someone whose hands remember a skill his brain had filed away. "Sit down," he said. "Don't talk to me. I'm plating." We ate together. 5 strangers at a steel table under fluorescent lights that buzzed with the particular frequency of government surplus ballast. And the food was extraordinary. Not because the ingredients were special, but because Nico had the hands, and because we'd forgotten that eating could be an experience rather than a task. Dana ate methodically. Tomas ate like he was afraid someone would take it away. Priya ate slowly, examining each bite. And I thought, she's memorizing this, filing it, in case it doesn't happen again. After dinner, Dana spread a nautical chart on the table. Tongue Point, the Columbia River, the Pacific coastline, all rendered in the precise language of depth soundings and navigational markers. The eastern perimeter, she said. The broadcast warned against it. I want to know why. Lethal to human contact, I quoted. That's what the subsignal said. Electrified, Tomas suggested. Possible. There's a transformer station on the east wall. I didn't get close. I did. Priya again, the flat declarative. It's not electric. There's a trench, 2 meters wide, 1 meter deep, filled with something. I couldn't identify it in daylight. It has a chemical smell. Chemical deterrent, Dana said. Military grade. Probably effective against infected who try to breach from the land side. Why the land side specifically? Nico asked. Dana pointed at the chart. The peninsula's eastern edge connected to the mainland through a narrow neck of land. Not the causeway we'd come in on, which was the western approach, but a secondary land bridge on the east side. And beyond that eastern land bridge, the chart showed the town of Tongue Point, a small community that would have had, before everything, maybe 200 residents. 200 people, I said, following the logic. 200 infected, potentially, who would walk straight down that land bridge to the eastern wall. The chemical trench stops them. The western causeway is longer, more exposed, and the water on either side is too fast for infected to wade. Natural choke point. The military designed this position to be defensible from both approaches. So we're safe, Tomas said, and the word hung in the air like a held breath. We're defended, Dana corrected. That's not the same thing. Safe means the threat doesn't exist. Defended means the threat exists and we have measures against it. The measures can fail. I liked Dana Marsh. I liked her with a specificity that surprised me, because I'd spent 45 days liking no one, not even Nico, not even myself. But I liked the way she used words. Precisely as tools without waste. She reminded me of my mother, who'd been a commercial fisherman out of Newport and who had been dead for 3 years before any of this started, which meant she was one of the lucky ones. The broadcast is still running, I said. Every hour it transmits. Every hour someone new might hear it. I know. Do we turn it off? Dana looked at me across the nautical chart, and I watched her weigh it. The broadcast was a beacon. It had brought us here. It would bring others. Others meant labor, skills, diversity of capability. Others also meant mouths, conflict, the unpredictable chemistry of strangers under pressure. Turning it off meant security. Leaving it on meant growth. Both options had teeth. We leave it on, she said, for now. But we control the gate. Nobody enters without vetting. And we start thinking about what this place could be. 4 words that contained an entire philosophy of intention. I went to bed that night in a room with a door that locked and a bed with sheets. And for the first time in 45 days, I did not sleep with a weapon in my hand. I slept with it on the nightstand, within reach. Progress is relative. They started arriving on the 3rd day. First, a couple from Longview, Washington. Brett and Shonda Campbell, mid-30s, both teachers, who had crossed the river in a stolen fishing boat and followed the broadcast signal on a handheld radio. Then a man alone, 60-ish, who gave his name as Walt and volunteered nothing else. Then a family. The Okafor Lynns, 2 mothers and a 12-year-old son named Miles, who walked through the gate with a backpack full of comic books and a solemnity that made my chest ache. Dana vetted each arrival at the gate with the same 3 questions. Where did you come from? What can you do? Are you bitten? The third question was the one that mattered, and the one that was hardest to verify, because bites could be hidden and lies could be fluent. She inspected arms, necks, and torsos. She checked ankles. She made people turn around. It was invasive and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. And no one objected because everyone understood. By the end of the first week, we were 14. By the end of the second week, 19. The barracks filled. Nico started cooking for 20. Priya organized the supply depot into a rationing system that tracked consumption against reserves and projected sustainability timelines. She'd been an operations analyst for a shipping company in Portland, it turned out, and her brain worked in logistics, the way Nico's hands worked in kitchens. Tomas maintained the generator and the perimeter infrastructure with a mechanical competence that belied his age. Dana coordinated everything, not through authority claimed, but through authority demonstrated, making decisions quickly and well enough that no one had yet found reason to challenge them. And I ran communications. The maritime receiver became the center of a small radio station I built in the antenna building, augmented with equipment from the supply depot. Two-way radios, a signal repeater, a battery-powered shortwave that let me scan beyond the maritime bands. I listened to the world, or what was left of it. Most frequencies were dead. Some carried automated messages like ours. Military installations, FEMA emergency broadcasts frozen in time. A single commercial station in Sacramento that played the same Fleetwood Mac album on repeat, presumably because the CD had been in the player when the station was abandoned and the backup power hadn't died yet. But some frequencies carried voices, scattered, intermittent, alive. A group in Eugene, a hem operator in Boise, a woman in Medford who broadcast every evening at 8 p.m. to say how many people she'd lost that day. I logged everything. I built a map of the living on a whiteboard in the antenna building, pins and strings like a detective's evidence board, trying to assemble a picture of what was still out there. The answer, as far as I could tell, was not much, but not nothing. On day 12 at the base, day 57 overall, I picked up a transmission that changed the dynamics of everything. It came from the south, strong signal, professional equipment. A man identifying himself as Colonel Aaron Voss, broadcasting from a FEMA staging area near Roseburg, Oregon. He was organized. He was military, and he was announcing that his group of approximately 200 survivors was moving north along Interstate 5, clearing infected as they went, establishing supply caches, and looking for other organized groups to coordinate with. I brought the recording to Donna. She listened without expression, then asked, "How far is Roseburg?" "About 200 miles south. If they're moving up I-5, they could reach the valley towns in 2 weeks, the coast in 3, if they divert west. If. He said he's looking for organized groups. We're an organized group. We're 19 people behind a wall. He's 200 with military discipline and probably military weapons. There's a word for what happens when a force that size encounters a resource cache like ours. He's not a raider, Donna. He's using FEMA protocols. FEMA protocols are a vocabulary. They don't tell you what the person using them actually intends. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't entirely right either. And this was the first crack I'd noticed in Dana's leadership. A tendency toward defensive isolation that had served us well in the early days, but might become a liability as the world reconstituted. You can't rebuild anything from behind a wall you never open. I said none of this. Instead, I said, "Can I establish contact? Just communication. No coordinates, no specifics. Just talk." She thought about it for a long time. Communication only. You do not tell them where we are. You do not tell them how many we are. You do not tell them what we have. Understood. I went back to the antenna building and started composing a response on the shortwave. And as I keyed the microphone, I felt something I hadn't felt in 57 days. The possibility that survival might not be enough. That what came after survival might actually matter. I made contact with Voss's group that evening. The operator on their end wasn't Voss himself, but a woman named Sergeant Adrian Cole, who had the clipped cadence of someone who'd been trained to transmit efficiently, and the faint warmth of someone who was glad to hear another voice. "This is Coastal Station, calling Roseburg Column. Do you copy? Coastal Station, this is Roseburg Column, copy. Go ahead. We're an organized survivor group on the Northern Oregon coast. 19 people, secured position, stable resources. We're receiving your broadcasts and interested in coordination. No location specifics at this time. Over." A pause. Then, "Coastal Station. Be advised. Roseburg Column is en route to the Willamette Valley. Current position is north of Canyonville. Estimated arrival Salem area in 10 days. Colonel Voss requests ongoing communication schedule. Proposed nightly check-in, 2100 hours. This frequency. Over." Roseburg Column, confirmed. Nightly check-in, 2100, this frequency. Coastal Station out. I logged the contact and felt the world get slightly larger. It had been contracting for 57 days. From planet to country to state to county to peninsula to wall. And this was the first expansion. The first indication that the map might grow rather than shrink. Over the following week, Sergeant Cole and I established a rhythm. Each evening at 9, I'd sit at the shortwave and we'd exchange information for 20 minutes. She told me about the column's progress, slow, methodical, clearing towns along I-5 with a combination of military tactics and improvised crowd management techniques. They'd lost 11 people since Roseburg. They'd gained 38. Their total was now 227. I told her about the coast, weather conditions, infected density estimates, tidal patterns. She was interested in tidal patterns because the column had discussed the possibility of establishing a coastal position for maritime access. I told her about the fog and how it changed the infected's behavior, making them more stationary. And she filed this with the hunger of someone building an operational picture. I did not tell her about Tongue Point. I did not tell her about the supply depot. I kept Dana's restrictions and hated myself slightly for each omission, because Sergeant Cole was giving me real, actionable intelligence, and I was giving her weather reports. On the 4th evening of contact, Cole went off script. "Coastal Station, personal question. How are your people?" "Healthy, fed, sheltered." "How are they?" "Morale." I looked through the antenna building's window at the courtyard below. Thomas was running cable for exterior lights. Shonda Campbell was teaching Miles Okafor Lynn something at a folding table. Math, maybe, or history. Some artifact of normalcy she was maintaining through sheer professional reflex. Nico was carrying supplies between buildings, and I could hear him humming. Actually humming. A thing he hadn't done in the first 45 days. "They're becoming something," I said. "I don't know what yet." "Us too," Cole said. And for just a moment the protocol fell away, and we were two women with radios trying to describe the ineffable process of people deciding to be a community instead of a collection of survivors. Then she said, "Coastal Station, be advised. We've encountered intelligence suggesting a large infected mass moving west from the Cascades into the Willamette Valley. Estimated numbers in the thousands. Origin unknown. Movement pattern suggests migration, not random dispersal. If this mass reaches the coast, positions in your area may be impacted. Please advise your leadership. Over. Thousands. Moving west, toward us. Roseburg Column. Can you specify timeline? Negative on precise timeline. Based on observed movement rates, estimate 3 to 4 weeks before potential coastal arrival. This is preliminary intelligence, not confirmed. But we are adjusting our own route accordingly. Understood? Will advise leadership. Coastal Station out." I sat in the antenna building for a long time after the transmission ended. Through the window, Tomas had finished the cable run, and the exterior lights came on, flooding the courtyard in white halogen. People moved through it. Our people, 19 of them, casting long shadows. In 3 to 4 weeks, the math of our wall and our trench and our razor wire would be tested against numbers we'd never been designed to withstand. I went to find Dana. She was in the supply depot, conducting inventory with Priya. I told them what Cole had said. Priya's hands stopped moving over the clipboard she was holding. Dana's didn't. She kept counting cans of beans, her lips moving silently. And only when she'd finished the row did she look at me. 3 to 4 weeks. Preliminary. Unconfirmed. But credible. Cole has been accurate about everything else she's told me. Dana set down the can she was holding. Then we have 3 to 4 weeks to decide whether we defend this position or abandon it. And if we defend it, we need to figure out what defending against thousands looks like, because right now, our plan handles dozens. There's a third option, I said, which is we coordinate with the column. 227 people with military leadership. If they divert to the coast, we combine forces. And then 227 strangers are inside our wall. Dana. It might not be our wall much longer. She held my gaze. In the fluorescent light of the supply depot, surrounded by the wealth of provisions that had made this place feel like salvation, I watched Dana Marsh confront the limits of defensibility, and I saw the exact moment she understood that walls are only as strong as the force they're designed to resist. Set up a meeting, she said. Me and Voss, radio, tomorrow night. Dana and Colonel Voss spoke for 40 minutes the following evening, and I listened from the operator's chair with my hands clasped in my lap and my heart doing something arrhythmic. 2 leaders, 2 styles. Dana was precise, transactional, skeptical. Voss was expansive, strategic, practiced. She gave information in measured doses. He gave it in confident strokes. They circled each other verbally, testing for sincerity the way you test ice. Weight applied gradually, listening for cracks. Voss confirmed the migrating mass. His scouts had observed it from ridgelines east of Eugene, a column of infected moving west through the Cascade Passes, flowing like water through the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance was the river valleys that all pointed toward the coast. He estimated 8 to 12,000, a number that made my vision narrow. Colonel, I have 19 people and a walled compound, Dana said. Your number is significant against any position I can hold. Agreed. Which is why I'm proposing we merge resources. Merge means you come here. Merge means we establish a joint defensive position at your location, assuming it's as sound as your operator has implied. We bring personnel, weapons, combat experience. You provide the fixed position, the supplies, the infrastructure. Together we hold. And after? Assuming we survive. What's the governance structure? That's a conversation for when we're not facing a horde. That's a conversation for right now, Colonel. Because if you walk 200 soldiers through my gate, I need to know whether I'm still running things on this side of the wall. Voss paused. I could hear the faint hiss of carrier static between them. The sound of radio waves crossing 100 miles of collapsed civilization. Joint authority, he said. Your position, your infrastructure decisions. My personnel, my tactical command during active defense. Neither overrides the other. And if we disagree during a crisis, then we argue fast and decide faster. I've been military for 22 years, Ms. Marsh. I know the difference between command and dictatorship. I'm not interested in taking your compound. I'm interested in surviving the next month. Dana looked at me. I gave her the only honest assessment I had, which was a small nod. Cole had been straight with me for a week. Voss's intelligence had checked out. The threat was real, and it was coming, and then we couldn't stop it alone. I'm going to share our position with you, Dana said into the microphone. Naval support activity, Tongue Point Annex. North shore of the Columbia River, east of Astoria. Western Causeway approach only. I'll transmit coordinates on a secure frequency. Received. We can be there in 12 days. Colonel, I need you here in 8. The mass is moving faster than your preliminary estimate. I've been monitoring seismic sensors in the antenna building. Vibration patterns suggest the leading edge is already past Eugene. I hadn't known about the seismic sensors. I looked at her sharply, and she returned the look with an expression that said, "I don't tell you everything either, man. Nobody tells anyone everything." After the transmission ended, Dana sat in the operator's chair I'd vacated and rubbed her temples with both hands. I'd never seen her show fatigue before. It made her look her age, which was 53 according to a conversation we'd had 2 nights ago over a can of peaches Nico had served with a caramel sauce he'd improvised from sugar packets and powdered cream. "Did I just do the right thing?" she asked. "I don't know. If he's lying, I just handed our position to a force that outnumbers us 10 to 1. If he's telling the truth, you just gave us a chance to survive what's coming. Both of those things could be true simultaneously." "Yes." She dropped her hands and looked at the radio equipment surrounding us. The maritime receiver, the shortwave, the signal repeater, the whiteboard map with its pins and strings showing the scattered remnants of human life along the coast. All of it technology built to connect across distance. All of it useless if the people on the other end weren't what they claimed to be. "Get everyone in the courtyard," she said. "Tonight, I'm going to tell them what's coming and what I've done. They deserve to know before the column arrives. Some of them will want to leave. That's their right. I won't hold anyone. Donna, if people leave, we're weaker. If people stay against their will, we're worse than weak. We're something I won't be part of." She stood. "Courtyard, 1 hour." She told them. All of it. The migrating mass, the column, the joint authority agreement, the timeline. She stood in the middle of 19 people under the exterior lights and laid out the situation with the same precision she used for everything. No softening, no spin, nobody left. Not because they weren't afraid. Miles Okafor Lynn was gripping his mother's hand so hard his knuckles were white, and Brett Campbell had the 1,000-yard stare of a man recalculating his mortality. But because every person in that courtyard had already survived enough to know that running from a threat without a destination is just dying with extra steps. Walt, the 60-ish loner who never volunteered anything, spoke for only the second time since he'd arrived. "I was Army Corps of Engineers, 30 years. If you need defensive structures beyond that wall, I can build them." And just like that, we started preparing for war. Walt transformed the peninsula in 6 days. He was methodical in a way that was almost meditative, walking the perimeter with a surveyor's eye, marking positions with spray paint, sketching diagrams on the backs of nautical charts. The man who never spoke became the man who never stopped directing, and the shift was so total that I wondered whether his silence had been not reticence, but conservation, storing his energy for the moment when his specific competence would be needed. He reinforced the Western Causeway with a secondary barrier, shipping containers from the old naval docks, dragged into position by a truck Tomas hot-wired and driven across the courtyard. The containers created a serpentine approach, forcing anything coming down the causeway to make 3 right-angled turns before reaching the gate. Infected moved in straight lines. Right-angled turns broke their momentum and funneled them into kill zones. On the eastern wall, he expanded the chemical trench and added a second line of defense. A dry moat dug with a small backhoe from the maintenance building, 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, lined with sharpened rebar stakes that Tomas cut and welded from the dock infrastructure. It was brutal. I helped drive stakes into the mud and tried not to think about what they'd look like in use. The dock itself became a fallback position. Walt identified a concrete pier extending 60 feet into the Columbia River, accessible from the compound through a gate in the northern wall. If the perimeter failed, the pier was our evacuation point. We'd retreat to the water's edge and hope the current was too strong for infected to follow. "This is a last resort plan," he told Dana. "If we're using the pier, we've already lost. What do we need to not lose? People who can shoot, coordination, and luck." The column arrived on day 8, exactly as promised. I was in the antenna building when Priya's voice crackled over the 2-way radio. "Vehicles on the causeway. Military. Count 11. I ran to the western wall and climbed the ladder Walt had bolted into the concrete. From the top, I could see the causeway stretching west toward Astoria, and on it, a convoy. 3 Humvees, 2 troop transports, 4 supply trucks, a fuel tanker, and an ambulance. They moved slowly through Walt's serpentine barriers, which did exactly what they were designed to do. Forced a deliberate, observed approach. Dana met them at the gate. Colonel Voss stepped out of the lead Humvee, and he was not what I'd expected. The voice on the radio had been commanding, large. The man was compact, 5'7", lean, dark-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like an academic than a soldier. He extended his hand to Dana, and she shook it, and I saw in their grip the establishment of a contract that no document could formalize. 231 people entered our compound over the next 3 hours. Soldiers, civilians, families. They came with weapons, supplies, medical equipment, and a field surgeon named Dr. Asha Kapoor, who immediately requisitioned the kitchen as a triage station and began inventorying our medical supplies with an urgency that suggested she'd been operating with inadequate resources for weeks. The population of Tongue Point went from 19 to 250 in an afternoon. The barracks overflowed. Tents went up in the courtyard. The generator's fuel consumption doubled. Nico looked at his kitchen, looked at the crowd, and said to me with absolute calm, "I need sous chefs. Find me 4 people who can hold a knife without cutting themselves." The integration was surprisingly smooth, and I credit Dana and Voss equally. They established a joint command structure within the first hour. Dana handling infrastructure, supply management, and civilian affairs. Voss handling perimeter defense, watch rotations, and tactical planning. They met every evening in the antenna building, which became a de facto command center, and I sat in on every meeting because the radio was mine, and information was the bridge between their domains. Sergeant Cole turned out to be exactly what her voice had promised. Competent, direct, and possessed of a dry humor that surfaced at unexpected moments. She found me in the antenna building the first night after the columnists arrived and said, "So your coastal station and your Roseburg column. Adrian, please, Marin." She looked at the whiteboard map, the radio equipment, the logs I'd kept of every transmission. "You built all this yourself?" With salvaged parts and no manual. The military spent $800 billion a year on communications infrastructure. You've matched our capability with a maritime receiver and some wire. Your capability got you here. Mine just listened. She smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from a stranger in 62 days. And it landed somewhere in my chest with a warmth I didn't examine too closely, because there wasn't time. The seismic sensors confirmed what Cole's scouts reported. The mass was 3 days out. Voss assembled the entire compound in their courtyard. 250 people standing in the February drizzle, breath visible, faces upturned. He stood on the bed of a supply truck and spoke without amplification, his voice carrying the way a trained voice does, not loud but projected. In approximately 72 hours, a concentrated mass of infected will reach the Oregon coast. Intelligence suggests 8 to 12,000. They're moving through the valley and will disperse when they hit the coast range, which means we won't face all of them. But we will face a significant fraction. Our defensive position is strong. Our supplies are adequate. Our weapons are sufficient. What will determine whether we hold this position is not material. It's coordination. Every person here has a role. If you don't have one yet, you will by tonight. This is not a siege. This is a defense. We hold until the mass passes, and then we rebuild whatever needs rebuilding. He stepped down. No applause, no questions. People dispersed to their stations with the grim efficiency of individuals who understood that preparation was the only antidote to fear. Voss's tactical plan was layered. The outer ring was the wall itself, reinforced by Walt's additions, manned by soldiers with rifles at 20-meter intervals. The second ring was the chemical trench and rebar moat on the eastern approach, plus the serpentine barriers on the western causeway. The third ring was the buildings themselves. with designated fallback positions inside each structure. The final ring was the dock and pier. Evacuation, if it came to that, onto the mothballed vessels that sat in the harbor. The ships don't run, Dana had said when the pier plan was first discussed. They float, Voss replied. That's enough. I spent the next 2 days on the radio. I contacted the group in Eugene. Gone. Their frequency silent. I contacted the ham operator in Boise, who confirmed that the mass had been visible from satellite imagery he'd accessed through a surviving NOAA uplink. The images were grainy, but unmistakable. A dark stain moving through the green of the Willamette Valley like ink spreading on wet paper. I contacted the woman in Medford. She was still broadcasting. Her count that evening was 4. She'd lost 2 more. How many did you start with? I asked, breaking my usual protocol of listening without engaging. 61. The number sat in my headphones like a stone. I gave her our frequency and our position, in case she could make it north, knowing she probably couldn't. On the final evening before the mass was projected to arrive, Nico cooked. He cooked the way he had on our first night. Deliberately, attentively, as if the quality of the food could influence the outcome of what was coming. The kitchen was chaos. 4 volunteer sous chefs working under his direction, while Dr. Kapoor's triage equipment sat on adjacent tables in a collision of purposes that somehow functioned. He made a fish stew. Someone in the column had brought vacuum-sealed salmon from a cold storage facility they'd raided near Roseburg, and Nico built a chowder around it with potatoes from MRE packets, reconstituted onions, and a cream sauce that he refused to explain. 250 people ate in shifts over 3 hours, and the courtyard smelled like a restaurant, and the absurdity of that. A gourmet meal on the eve of a horde was so profound that it circled back around to being exactly right. I ate with Adrian Cole. We sat on the concrete pier with our legs dangling over the Columbia, bowls in our laps, watching the river move in the darkness. This is good, she said. The food. Nico was a sous chef. Before. She said the word the way everyone said it now, as a complete temporal system. Before needed no further specification. Everyone knew what it meant. I was a high school basketball coach. Before. And now you're a sergeant. I was National Guard. Weekend warrior stuff. When everything happened, I was the highest-ranked person in my unit who hadn't been bitten. So, she shrugged with one shoulder. Battlefield promotion. What were you? Before? I'd been avoiding this question for 62 days. What I'd been before was a marine biologist at Oregon State, specializing in intertidal ecology, which was useless information in a world where the tidal zones had been abandoned, along with everything else. What I'd become was a radio operator, a scavenger, and a translator between people who needed to talk to each other but didn't know how. I was someone who studied the space between water and land, I said. The intertidal zone, where one thing becomes another. Adrienne looked at me. That sounds about right for what you do now. Below us, the river moved. Somewhere south, thousands of infected were walking toward the coast with the same mindless persistence as the tide. They came on the morning of day 67, not from the east as we'd expected, but from the southeast, flowing down the rail corridor I'd walked with Nico 3 weeks earlier. The rail corridor, our safe highway, our trusted path, turned into an arterial feeding the mass directly toward the peninsula's eastern approach. I was in the antenna building when the first watch reports came in, calm voices on the radio. Trained soldiers using numerical designations and grid references, but underneath the professional language was the vibration of genuine alarm. The numbers were higher than projected. Not 8,000, not 12,000. The scouts on the eastern wall estimated 20,000 in the visible column, with no end in sight. Voss was on the wall within minutes. Dana was in the supply depot, coordinating ammunition distribution. I stayed on the radio because that was my role, relaying information between positions, maintaining the communication web that allowed 250 people spread across a compound to function as a single organism. The mass hit the chemical trench first. I couldn't see it from the antenna building, but I could hear it. Not the sound I'd been avoiding describing, not yet, but a physical rumble. The vibration of thousands of bodies pressing against Earth. The chemical deterrent worked. For an hour, nothing crossed the trench. The infected reached the edge and stopped, repelled by whatever compound the military had filled it with. And they accumulated along the trench line like water behind a dam. Eastern trench holding, Voss reported. They're building up. Pressure is increasing. Pressure. Infected in large numbers didn't behave like individuals. They behaved like fluid. The ones in front couldn't advance. The ones behind kept pushing. The math was simple and terrible. Enough pressure from behind would push the front ranks through any deterrent, because the ones being pushed had no choice and no self-preservation instinct to resist. By noon, the trench was breached. Not by the infected overcoming the chemical, by the infected being physically crushed into it by the weight of those behind, their bodies filling the trench until it was a bridge of compressed remains that the next wave walked over. Walt had predicted this possibility. The rebar moat was the backup. And for another hour, it held. Nico found me in the antenna building during the second hour. He was carrying a rifle he'd been issued that morning, holding it the way you hold something you've been trained on for 3 days and don't trust. Marin, the kitchen shut down. Kapoor has full triage. What do I do? You find a position on the wall and you help. I'm a cook. You're a person with a weapon and 2 eyes. Get on the wall. He went. I watched him cross the courtyard, shoulders tight, and felt the specific guilt of sending someone you care about toward danger from the safety of a radio room. But the radio room wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. The infected were piling against the eastern wall with a weight that I could feel in the floor. A subtle tremor transmitted through the concrete foundation, and the sound was growing. The sound. I have to describe it now because it's relevant to what happened. Infected don't moan or groan like movies suggested they would. The sound they make is respiratory. A forced exhalation through constricted airways, rhythmic like a broken ventilator. One of them is almost inaudible. 1,000 of them creates a sound like wind through a canyon, constant and alive in a way that bypasses your rational brain and speaks directly to something ancient in your nervous system. It is the sound of breathing that shouldn't be happening, multiplied until it becomes weather. That sound was in the walls now, in the floor, in my chest. Western Causeway, contact, a voice said on the radio. A second front. They'd come around the peninsula's south shore through the tidal flats, something we hadn't thought possible because the mud should have trapped them. But the tide was out. The flats were exposed, and thousands of infected were walking across them toward the causeway with a stumbling deliberation that I knew, that I'd been watching for 67 days, that I would see in my sleep for whatever remained of my life. Walt's serpentine barriers held them at the causeway entrance. The right-angle turns did exactly what they were designed to do. Broke the momentum, created bottlenecks, gave the shooters on the wall clear firing lanes. But there were so many. The lanes filled with bodies, and the bodies became ramps, and the ramps became bridges. And the organic engineering of a horde solving obstacles through sheer mass was something no defensive plan could fully counter. All positions, this is command, Voss's voice on the radio. Hold the wall. Conserve ammunition. Aimed shots only. We hold. They held the wall for 9 hours. I know this because I logged every transmission, every report, every request for ammunition or medical support. And the timestamps tell the story in a language more precise than my memory. The eastern wall held until 4 p.m., when a section of concrete cracked under the accumulated pressure and a gap opened that soldiers filled with bodies, and then with gunfire, and then with the shipping containers Walt directed into position using the truck Tomas drove. With an expression of concentrated terror that I watched through binoculars from the antenna building window. The western causeway held longer until 7 p.m., when the serpentine barriers were finally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of infected funneling through the tidal flats. The shooters on the western wall fell back to the secondary positions inside the compound, and for 30 minutes, the courtyard itself became a combat zone, infected pouring through the breached gate while soldiers and civilians alike fought with rifles, axes, improvised weapons, and in at least one case, a kitchen knife wielded by Nico Herrera with a precision that had nothing to do with his 3 days of weapons training and everything to do with 20 years of understanding how a blade moves through resistance. I came down from the antenna building when the courtyard was breached. There was no choice. The building's ground floor was compromised, and I either descended into the fight or waited to be cornered. I took the 9mm I'd carried since day one, and I entered the courtyard. And I will not describe what I did there, because some experiences exist beyond the reach of narration. But I will say that I survived it, and that I was not the same person afterward, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the literal neurological sense. Something in the architecture of my fear responses was permanently rewritten in that courtyard. Voss called the retreat to the pier at 8:15 p.m. The word went out on every radio simultaneously. All positions, fall back to the northern pier. Repeat. Fall back to the northern pier. Bring wounded. Leave everything else. 250 people became a river flowing north through the compound, through the gate in the northern wall, onto the concrete pier extending into the Columbia. The pier was 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, and it was designed to handle loading equipment, not a crowd. But we packed onto it with a desperate compression of people who understood that the water on 3 sides was the only barrier left. The infected followed us to the pier's entrance. They pressed against the narrow gate in the northern wall. A bottleneck. The last bottleneck. A choke point that 3 soldiers with automatic weapons held for 22 minutes, while everyone else packed onto the concrete tongue extending over the river. Dana was beside me. She had blood on her face. Not hers, she said, though I wasn't sure she knew. She was counting heads. I heard her lips moving. 47, 48, 49. How many? I asked. I need to finish counting, she finished. She looked at me with an expression that contained no emotion I could name, because it was all of them simultaneously. 211, she said. 39 short. 39 people who were not on the pier. Some of them were dead in the courtyard. Some were trapped in buildings. Some had been on the eastern wall when it fell and had never made it back. I thought of the woman in Medford and her nightly count, and understood now why she did it. Counting the living was the only way to acknowledge the dead without drowning in it. Voss was at the pier's edge, directing the soldiers holding the gate. The infected were pressing, but the bottleneck was holding. The gate was narrow enough that only 2 or 3 could push through at a time, and the soldiers were dropping them efficiently. But ammunition was finite, and the horde was not. The ships, Voss said to Dana. You said they don't run. They float. Then we get on them, and we cut the moorings, and we float. The current will take us downriver, anywhere that isn't here. Dana looked at the mothballed vessels tied to the pier, 2 decommissioned patrol boats, gray and oxidized, sitting low in the water with the resigned posture of machines that had given up on purpose. They wouldn't run, but they'd float, and the river would move them, and infected couldn't swim. Everyone on the boats, Dana called. Now, move. What followed was not orderly. It was 211 people climbing, jumping, being lifted, and thrown onto 2 vessels that were never meant to carry that many, their decks listing under the sudden weight, their moorings groaning. I jumped and landed badly on the deck of the forward patrol boat, my ankle turning under me with a bright spike of pain. Adrian Cole caught my arm and kept me from going over the side. I've got you, she said, and I believed her with a totality that had nothing to do with evidence, and everything to do with the fact that her hand on my arm was the most solid thing in a world that was liquefying. The last soldiers through the gate jumped for the boats as Tomas, 22 years old, who maintained generators and drove trucks, and had never once complained about anything. Cut the moorings with a fire axe, swinging twice on each rope and then leaping for the stern as the current caught us and pulled us away from the pier. The pier receded. The compound receded. The infected reached the pier's edge and stood there, hundreds of them, staring at us with the vacant intentness that was the only expression they had, and the sound of their breathing carried across the water, growing fainter, growing tolerable, growing finally into something that could be mistaken for wind. We floated for 3 hours. The Columbia carried us west, toward the ocean, past the dark shapes of Astoria on the south bank, and the scattered lights, meaning someone was alive over there, meaning the world continued to contain functioning electricity in places we hadn't known about. Of Washington on the north bank. The 2 patrol boats stayed together, connected by ropes Voss's soldiers rigged between them, drifting as a single unit through the darkness. Dr. Kapoor treated the wounded on the deck of the aft boat, working by flashlight, her hands steady despite the sway. 14 people with serious injuries, 26 with minor injuries. The rest were intact in body, if not in anything else. I found Nico sitting against the forward boat's wheelhouse, his kitchen knife still in his hand, staring at nothing. I sat beside him. "You okay?" "I stabbed 11 of them, Marin." "I know." I counted. "I know." Why did I count? I didn't have an answer for that. Maybe because counting was the human reflex. When faced with the uncountable, the mind's attempt to impose arithmetic on chaos. Maybe because Nico, who had counted ingredients and portions and plate temperatures for his entire professional life, could only process violence through the same metric framework. Maybe because 11 was a number he could hold, and the alternative was holding something without edges. I put my hand on his arm, the way I'd done in the supply depot when he held the canned peaches, and this time he leaned into it, his weight against my shoulder, and we sat like that while the river moved beneath us. At 11 p.m., Voss made a decision. The river's mouth was approaching, the point where the Columbia emptied into the Pacific, and beyond it was open ocean, which the patrol boats couldn't survive. He ordered the boats steered toward the north bank, toward the Washington shore, where the current was slower and a series of shallow bays offered potential landing sites. Soldiers improvised oars from deck equipment and paddled. It was absurd. 2 decommissioned Navy patrol boats being rowed like canoes by soldiers using signal poles and deck planks. But it worked. We grounded on a sandy bank near a place I later identified as Chinook, Washington, a town of maybe 600 people that appeared from the water to be dark and empty. We climbed off the boats in the shallows. 211 people wading through knee-deep water to a beach where no one was waiting. No one was shooting, and no infected were visible. The fog was thick. The air was cold. The sand under my feet was the most beautiful surface I'd ever stood on, because it was not concrete, and it was not the deck of a dying ship, and it was solid. Dana and Voss conferred on the beach while people collapsed around them, sitting and lying on the sand in postures of exhaustion that looked, from a distance, like the aftermath of a shipwreck, which is exactly what it was. "We lost the compound," Dana said. "We kept the people," Voss replied. "Most of them. That's the math now. Most is victory." I didn't agree with that entirely, but I understood what he meant. The compound had been a place. The people were a project. The place was gone, but the project was standing on a beach in Washington, breathing fog, and the project could move. Adrian found me at the waterline. She had a cut above her left eye that Kapoor had closed with butterfly strips, and her uniform was soaked to the waist. She stood beside me, and we looked south across the Columbia toward Oregon, where somewhere in the fog, the Tongue Point Peninsula was being consumed by thousands of infected who would eventually move on. Because that was what they did. They were migratory, not territorial. And in a week or a month, the compound would be empty again, reclaimed by nothing. "Coastal station," she said. Roseburg column? What now? The question was tactical and existential simultaneously. What now meant, where do we go? How do we eat? Where do we sleep tonight? It also meant, what is the point of this? What are we building? What comes after survival? I thought about the radio in my pack. The maritime receiver, waterlogged but possibly functional. The one tool I'd carried from the beginning. I thought about the frequencies I knew, the voices I'd logged, the woman in Medford counting her dead. I thought about the whiteboard map I'd left behind, the pins and strings charting human life along a coast that was being overrun. We find high ground, I said. We set up the radio, we start listening again, and we figure out where to go that isn't behind a wall, because walls don't hold. They just delay. So what does hold? I looked at the beach. 211 people. Some sleeping, some crying, some already standing and organizing. The human reflex toward structure asserting itself even here, even now, on a foggy beach in a state none of us had planned to be in. Nico was unpacking cooking supplies. Tomas was checking the boats for salvageable equipment. Walt was studying the terrain above the beach with the evaluating squint I'd come to recognize. Miles Okafor Lynn was sitting between his mothers, reading a comic book by flashlight, and the absolute normalcy of that act, a child reading, was so defiant that it qualified as architecture. I said, this holds. Not forever, not perfectly, but this. Adrienne looked at the people on the beach. Then she looked at me. Then she sat down on the sand and pulled the radio from my pack and started checking it for water damage. Her hands moving with the practical efficiency of someone who has decided that the next thing is the only thing. And the next thing, right now, was making sure we could still hear the world. I sat beside her and helped. The receiver's casing was cracked, but the circuitry looked intact. We'd need to dry it, replace the battery, find an antenna. Solvable problems. Specific, finite, addressable problems, which were the only kind worth thinking about at 1 a.m. on a beach in Washington with 209 other people and a world that had not ended, but had changed so thoroughly that the word ended and the word changed had become synonyms. Dawn was 5 hours away. By dawn, we'd have the radio working or we wouldn't. We'd have a plan or we wouldn't. We'd have certainty or we wouldn't. But we'd have each other, the irreducible unit that no horde could outnumber, because it wasn't a quantity. It was a decision, renewed every morning, to remain. The broadcasts resumed on day 70. I sat on a hillside above Chinook with a repaired receiver and a salvaged antenna, and spoke into a frequency that the fog carried south across the Columbia, and out to sea, and into the silence, where anyone might be listening. This is Marinvik, broadcasting from the north shore of the Columbia River. We are 211 survivors. We have medical capability, skilled labor, and organizational structure. We are not behind a wall. We are mobile, resourceful, and looking for others. If you can hear this, respond on this frequency. If you can't respond, follow the river west. We'll find you. I broadcast every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk. On the third day, someone answered, a voice from the Olympic Peninsula, faint, uncertain, alive. I wrote down their position. I added a pin to the map I was rebuilding on a piece of driftwood planed flat. I told them we were coming. The fog lifted, not all the way, just enough to see the shape of what was ahead, which was not safety and not peace, but the persistent, stubborn possibility that what we were building could outlast what was trying to end it. I turned up the gain and listened.